The NBA doesn't get to hog all of the trade headlines today, and it looks like the NFL wants to jump in on the trade fun. When the day started, it was reported the Miami Dolphins and Jacksonville Jaguars are discussing a trade involving starting left tackle Brandon Albert and tight end Julius Thomas. The Miami Herald is now reporting that the trade will actually be Albert in exchange for a late-round draft pick. For Phil Savage, Jim Trotter, and Jared Bell, I'm Jason Fitz, and we're off and running on NFL Insiders. So, Phil, let me ask you first, walk me through this process from the mind of a GM. How do we go from player for player this morning to player for draft pick now?
Well, first of all, I think you have to go back to the end of last week when Mike Tannenbaum and the Miami Dolphins revealed that Brandon Albert was going to be cut or released. And at that point, that's when they began to field some calls about, wait a minute, before you put Albert out there, we want to have access to him. And that's what got the Jaguars engaged. I don't know if the clubs, I'm sure they kicked around the idea of player for player. I think that's pure speculation, but as it turns out now, it looks like it's going to be a late-round pick for Brandon Albert.
I mean, the question is for Julius Thomas at this point, what's his mindset, right? This morning he was trade bait, now he's still on the team?
No, I don't think his mindset really matters. That's part of being a player in the NFL, that your name could come up in trade discussions. So for Julius, it's more about getting on the field and performing and living up to the contract that he earned last year. So no one's going to feel sorry for him that his name came up at this point.
Yeah, and I think one of the things when you look at just kind of how this whole thing has evolved, there are so many different layers. And one of the layers may have been whether or not Julius Thomas would accept less money to be part of a trade. And apparently that's not going to happen right now. So when you have a situation where people know you're going to release a guy, boy, you lose a lot of leverage in terms of trying to move that guy. And I think that's one of the things that the Dolphins have found out here is that, hey, when word gets out that you're going to let go of a guy, it's very difficult to make that deal.
Yeah, and for teams that are in the left tackle market, this 2017 NFL draft is not really that strong for the overall offensive line class. And so with that in the backdrop, I think a team like Jacksonville that was really looking for a veteran blindside protector for a struggling young quarterback in Blake Bortles, that's the attraction for them. So, you know, they get Brandon Albert and give up a late-round pick, of which there's no way that later-round pick would turn into a starting left tackle.
I mean, it's win for the Jags, and I feel like this is sort of an annual conversation. When we hit the offseason, it's a win for the Jags. Why does this move play out to be any different in your mind than it has in years past?
No, we don't know that it will. I mean, if you look at last season, some of the moves they made in free agency at least, you bring in Malik Jackson, Clifford Ivory, Gibson, Prince Akamora, Kelvin Beachum, and those moves didn't all work out for the Jags. You go back the year before that, they signed Julius Thomas to the big contract. So one thing we've learned about this league, in most cases, you are not going to win on the field if you rely on free agency to build your team. You've got to do it through the draft. And we know that last year the Jags had a strong draft, we believe. And if those young players can start to develop and come up, now maybe you can supplement it with some of these other guys, so it's not as pronounced in terms of, the focus on what players, veteran players, you bring in from the outside.
Yeah, but it's layer on top of layer on top of layer. When you're trying to rebuild, get as many good players as you can. But like you said, Phil, a left tackle, that position, when you're talking about really trying to solidify the protection, Brandon Albert could really be a big deal here if he can stay healthy. That's been one of the problems he's had in Miami, is staying healthy. And Julius Thomas, by the way, injury problems, too, since signing as a free agent. So if he can stay healthy, big deal for them.
And Brandon sounds very motivated. He did an interview with the Sun Sentinel, and he said his weight is down to 305, I believe. He looked very good. Now, he says he's motivated. He's changed some things in his life. So if he can go out and he can play well, that's a boon for the Jaguars at this point for only a seventh-round pick.
And one more thing to add, looking at it from Miami's perspective, last year you drafted Laramie Tunsil, right? So you knew at some point he was going to ultimately end up as your left tackle. So I think the writing was on the wall to do something with Brandon Albert really for a while now.
Yeah, I was getting ready to add that this was a chain reaction to the fall in the draft of Laramie Tunsil, because the Miami Dolphins were not really in the market for a left tackle in last year's draft. They had Brandon Albert, but then all of a sudden Tunsil ends up in their lap at pick number 13. They take him, and the writing was on the wall from that point forward that Tunsil would play left guard for a year and then kick out to the left side at tackle for his second season.
So this obviously has an impact to the Jags on expectation, right? So we have to look at some point at Blake Bortles, and I think every franchise is obviously identified to some degree to their quarterback. So the question becomes, you add this, how does this change any expectations for the Jags and Bortles moving forward?
Well, the one thing you want to do with a quarterback, obviously, is protect him. And Blake has had some issues with protection, and we know he's had issues with turnovers. So the hope down in Jacksonville is that if they can protect him better, that maybe he becomes more conscious of what he's doing with the football and taking care of the football. But there's no question it's time for him at this point to step up. You know, he had a huge drop-off last season versus the year before. And they've got to figure out now, is he the guy to lead them long term? And this is a big year for him.
And going back to Julius Thomas for a minute, when they brought him in a couple of years ago, it was with the idea of hoping he could be that big red zone target. They've got the big play receivers on the outside. And now when you get in the red zone, we saw Julius Thomas do that when he was in Denver with Peyton Manning, by the way. 24 touchdowns over 2 years. Well, in Jacksonville, he's had 9 touchdowns in 2 seasons. He's been injured, missed some games, but still, that just kind of shows the lack of impact he's had in the red zone with Blake Bortles.
This is a make-or-break year for Blake Bortles. Under a new regime, under new management with Tom Coughlin, they're going to give him 1 year to prove what he can do.
It feels like a win-win for the Jags at some point. They get a starting left tackle for a low draft pick. They're not the only ones making significant moves. The Dolphins are continuing to make moves above and beyond this one. Cameron Wake, the Dolphins have signed 35-year-old defensive end Cameron Wake to a 2-year contract extension. According to ESPN's Adam Schefter, the extension is worth $19 million with $11 million guaranteed. Wake led Miami with 11.5 sacks last year and made his 5th career Pro Bowl. All eyes seem to continue to stay focused on Kirk Cousins and with his future with the Washington Redskins. Senior NFL writer at TheUndefeated.com, Jason Reed, joins us now to break this down. Cousins was franchised by the Redskins last year. Many expect he will again be franchised this year at a value of $23.9 million. Jason, what do you think the mindset of Kirk Cousins is right now?
Well, I think it's the same as it was last year, that he wants to be truly wanted by this organization. And by truly wanted, that means he wants a contract which he believes he deserves, a multi-year deal, a massive multi-year deal that would put him with the elite quarterbacks in the game. And in absence of receiving that, he doesn't want to be here. He's very glad with taking the tag again, playing for $23.95 million, and then at the end of the year, most likely becoming a free agent, or at least no longer being with this team. It all comes down to how he views himself and how they view him. And so far, those two things haven't matched up.
So where does all of this tension originate from between Cousins and the team?
Well, like most things with the Washington Redskins, it all goes back to Robert Griffin III. When Kirk Cousins came here as a rookie with Robert Griffin III, it was understood by the people in high-ranking management that he was just a backup quarterback. But Mike and Kyle Shanahan thought he could be more. And in a game in Cleveland where Kirk Cousins started for Robert Griffin III, he had a great game as a rookie. They won the game. They continued their winning streak, and they won the division. People in this organization who have high-ranking positions who are still there totally blew Kirk Cousins off. They didn't acknowledge what he did in the locker room. And you could say, well, hey, this is a big boy league. Put your big boy pants on. But if you're a starting quarterback in this league and you've done the things that he's done, you want to feel appreciated by your organization. There have been many things like that anecdote over the last 5 years that have happened to where it hasn't created a lot of goodwill on his part.
So realistically, with all of the negativity and all of the drama, what does it take at this point to actually get a deal done?
Well, I mean, he's going to want a deal. The tag is $23.95. He's going to want something in guaranteed money that starts around there that is going to get him a deal that's going to put him in that Andrew Luck territory. I don't know if he would actually, hold out for exactly that dollar figure, guaranteed dollar figure, but he wants to be paid like an elite quarterback. So in the absence of that happening, what I see happening is them tagging him again, and we start this whole process anew.
Fantastic stuff. ESPN.com senior NFL writer at TheUndefeated.com, Jason Reed. Jason, thanks for taking the time to join us today. Again, Kirk Cousins was franchised last year. If, as expected, he's again franchised this year, it'll be at a cost of $23.98 million. By rule, if they try to franchise him again next year, it'd be at a value of a whopping $34 million. Obviously, that's not realistic. So the question becomes, guys, does this actually get worked out?
I think this is a reluctant marriage that ultimately will work itself out because the Redskins do not have an alternative answer. be it in the draft or free agency or trying to trade for someone else. I think that they will tag him to buy the time that will give them until July 15th to get a long-term deal worked out.
No, but here's the danger. If they do franchise tag him, just as a year ago, he signed it immediately after he was franchised. And so the team has to be very careful from that standpoint. The one thing I love about Kirk Cousins is that he is straight gangsta, not ER, straight gangsta, ends with an A. From that standpoint, owners are used to always having the leverage against players, and players will often capitulate for money. Kirk understands what his value is, and he is not going to short sell himself. He looks at it now as, look, I got $20 million last year, I get $24 this year. That's $44 million over 2 years. And then I go out on the free agent market next year, where if he has another season relative to what he had last year and this year, he can look to get guarantees at a minimum of $40 to $50 million, which means he will have made close to $90 million to $100 million over 3 years. I think he's okay with that.
Jim, I cannot disagree with you. Timing is everything, right? But I think that's the first time in my life I've ever heard the term straight gangster and Kirk Cousins in like the same sentence.
I say it respectfully.
No, because Kirk Cousins is a mild-mannered type of guy and definitely has respect for what he's done and how he's been able to progress in his career. But, you know, Jason was talking about him not being happy with being franchise tagged twice in a row. Hey, for $44 million for 2 years, there's nothing really to be. I'd like to have that level of unhappiness, because if he gets the market, like you said, in this league with no quarterbacks, he'll have an opportunity.
You know, the beauty here for me is that you have a player who understands his market value, understands leverage, and is willing to bet on himself and is not going to take less than what he can get. He is maximizing his earnings. And, you know, at times I've been criticized before because I would say that a contract I felt wasn't good, in part because I said I felt a player had leverage and didn't maximize it. Kirk is doing that. Short of Darrelle Revis, he may be the most mercenary player in the NFL that I've ever been around in my 2 decades.
With all those problems, throwing picks and things falling apart in the red zone at that.
I mean, Phil, at the end of the day, the franchise tag's about business, right? So you've given us a list of some of the guys that you're looking at that you think have to be tagged. And when you look at this process, where does Cousins sort of fall on this list?
Yeah, I think Kirk is a priority for the Redskins because they've made an investment into teaching him this intricate West Coast passing attack. And that's the danger of the Redskins, that they've put all this time into Kirk Cousins. He's a perfect fit for them. I just can't see them walking away without getting a deal done.
You know, as I look at this list, I would say, you know, the priority for me, if there's one team that has to sign it, it's got to be the Chiefs. Got to decide Eric Berry or Dontari Poe. One of those two have to get done to sign the other.
Yo, everybody get up! Everybody get up! Everybody needs to understand that I'm more than simply a hype man for this rap group, just like Geico is more than just a company that can save you money. Geico also has fast and friendly claim service, so they can help you when you need it most. And while I do love being a hype man, I also love reading for children's audiobooks. Like Little Bo Peep, she lost a sheep, and she don't know where to find them. Yo!
Geico. Expect great savings and a whole lot more.
Darrelle Revis was released on bond Friday following his arraignment on 5 criminal charges stemming from an alleged incident in Pittsburgh that took place last Sunday. Now, TMZ has released the video of the incident for the world to see. So given all the information that's out there about Revis, the first question is, how should the Jets handle this?
Well, I think we've talked about this since it happened. I don't know if this really is going to affect what the Jets are going to do with Darrelle Revis, because you're talking about a player who has been declining for the past couple of years, and they were going to have to make a decision with him in any event. In terms of the situation with the legal situation, there are so many questions, and that video that we just saw from the aftermath of the event raises some more questions. So the first thing that I thought when I heard it was, that's not Darrelle Revis on that video. That does not sound like Darrelle Revis. Now, I'm not around Darrelle Revis like a lot of people and whatnot, but I've also talked to 2 people not in the Revis camp to ask them their opinions of his voice, and I'm not hearing anybody saying that sounds like Darrelle Revis. More questions to this deal.
I mean, Jim, your thoughts when you look at that?
Well, look, let me say this. The thing about this situation that disturbs me, again, is that everyone wants to jump to conclusions. And right away when this happened, Darrelle Revis was painted in a bad light. Here is a player who has never, off the field, to my knowledge, done anything that, deserved any sort of criticism, gotten into legal trouble, any of that. Darrell has always been a guy who took care of his business, handled it in a professional manner, in a silent manner, if you will. So to have folks come out now, and I've heard people basically jump to conclusions like because he was charged, he's guilty. A charge is not a conviction. So what I want is to hear Darrell's side of the story about what went down before I start making any sort of conclusions about what to draw from what we saw.
To that end, guys, why is Darrelle Revis not getting any benefit of the doubt?
It's a great question. I don't know. There's nothing in his track record that says you should believe he would be in this situation or that he actually did this, so I don't have an answer for that.
I think he gets the benefit of the doubt, at least he does in my mind, for the reasons that Jim explained there too, because these things can be very tricky in terms of charges, and sometimes we've seen situations before where charges are made basically to try to squeeze more information out of somebody. So maybe
remember
that's a possibility.
Last year, Shady McCoy had the episode in Philadelphia, and ultimately all of that went away at the end of the day, so to speak. So with Darrelle Revis, I think the Jets will just play it close to the vest and then just wait to see by March 9th they have to make a decision. They've already made that decision, in my opinion, and this will just be an afterthought in terms of whether they have to eat that $6 million that's on the table.
Yeah, two separate deals.
Well, through it all, it's going to work itself out quickly because essentially it has to, right? I mean, we have to get an answer on it quickly. Time now for our closing bell.
What good is an injury report if the NFL is hesitant in making people pay for their violations? After letting the Seahawks off the hook for not disclosing Richard Sherman's knee injury, the NFL is investigating the Steelers now for failing to list Le'Veon Bell's groin injury. Let's see if Pittsburgh gets a warning too, or a stiffer penalty like the way the Jets got hammered in 2008 for not disclosing Brett Favre's arm injury, or the second-round pick supposedly in play for the Sherman case. Bottom line, the NFL needs to tighten up. Two members of the competition committee told me that this is of no major concern as they dive into their off-season review of rules and policies. But it should be. Ask the Patriots. In this post-Deflategate era, the credibility of the league office swings with how it handles alleged violations.
It's never one thing. It's a culmination, to Jared's point. And if anything, the one thing that we continue to see accumulating is inconsistencies from a league office. It's impossible to predict, right?
No, that's absolutely where the league gets in trouble, because now if it comes out and disciplines the Steelers after not disciplining the Seahawks, the question becomes why, and that hasn't been answered to this point. All the league will say at this point is that it is investigating it. But you go back to when the Jets had Brett Favre. They fined the Jets for just such a violation. So the question becomes, why isn't the league more consistent in terms of how it metes out discipline? But it's not limited to the injury report. You can go to the personal conduct policy. Players get hammered, owners don't get touched. So again, the league has to be more consistent in these matters if it wants people to back off, in terms of the optics of what it's doing.
And, of course, this featured two very high-profile players that every fantasy league in America knows who Le'Veon Bell and Richard Sherman are. So maybe that has something to do with the way they have basically taken a bit of a hands-off policy, because we know Richard Sherman would have an opinion on it.
Well, what's interesting, Phil, as we talked about earlier, injuries can be such a gray area in terms of whether or not something is serious enough. Does it rise to the level that he's going to practice or not, or is it minor or not? This is a real situation, because some teams can use those reports in all sorts of ways.
It's an opportunity, too. To your end, they're star players. You treat star players with consistency, it can send a message.